could you tell us a bit about like how you found out it was endometriosis and got diagnosed and all of that process?
Yeah, so like you said, it is a very long-winded process. I was very fortunate in that I get private healthcare through my dad. So my process, although it was still long, it was nowhere near as long as it is for most
Mm.
people, especially if you have to go through the NHS. So the first time I had pain like that, both me and my mum thought that I had food poisoning, which goes back to what I said about the food poisoning feelings. So I remember it was one evening, and I think we had some family round or something, and it got to like 8 or 9 p.m. and I just got struck down with these awful, awful stomach cramps. I remember I spent the entire night just sitting on the toilet, just feeling absolutely disgusting. And my mum like was on the phone to NHS 111, like we were trying to figure out what was wrong with me. Even the doctor thought it was severe food poisoning. So a couple of days later, we were like, oh, whatever bug that was, thank God that's out the way. Only for the next month to come around and the exact same thing to happen again. So this starts to happen a few times, and then you go to the doctors. I think I was about 14, I think, when this happened for the first time.
So
So
4 years after getting your first period, roughly, or a
yeah,
few?
I'd say 14 or 15. So yeah,
Okay.
about 5 years, 4 or 5 years after getting my first period. So then my mum takes me to the doctors. The doctor's like, oh, painful periods are a normal part of growing up, like just gotta accept it. And I was like, but it's so painful. Surely it doesn't have to be this painful. So at
Mm.
this point, I think my mum also didn't realize how painful I was finding this. I think she almost kind of thought as well, like, oh, it's painful, but everyone goes through it, it's fine. So she was just giving me ibuprofen. I remember at some point a couple of months further down the line, I found that we had cocodamol, so like weak codeine and paracetamol. We had some of
Mm.
that in the cupboard. So when I was in severe pain, she would let me have some of that. This process continued for, I'd say, another 2 years. And then eventually I was like, you know what, like surely this is not normal pain. Surely this is not
Mm.
something that everyone's going through every single month, because it meant that when it hit, then if I was at school, I would just get really, really anxious because I'd be in so much pain and I'd be sat there. And obviously at school, you can't just leave, you just have to stay there.
Yeah.
And then when I was doing my A levels, when I was at sixth form, if I was in that much pain, or rather when I knew that I was about to be in that much pain, I would just have to drive straight home and I would just get into bed. I would take the codeine that I'd started finding around the house, and then that would be where I would stay for the next day or two. In terms of getting diagnosed, so it wasn't until I was at university and I went to see a specialist there, and I had an ultrasound to see if there was anything they could spot that was going on in that region. I
A
then
specialist in endometriosis or a specialist in
Oh, just a gynecologist.
a
So
gynecologist.
specialist for
Okay.
that region, but yeah,
Mm.
not specifically for endo. So yeah, I had the ultrasound, and then I had an MRI with dye. So what
Okay.
they do is they put the dye into your bloodstream, and then you have an MRI, and they look to see where the dye is going in that region. So that was like a pelvic MRI, which again showed to them there's something going on here, but we don't really know what it is. After
Mm.
that, they were like, okay, so it looks like you do have endometriosis, but we're not going to find out unless you have a laparoscopy. So that's where they shove a camera through your belly button, and just above, or kind of at the bottom of your stomach. And they put a camera through there and they have a look around and see what they can find,
Is it
which for
painful?
most people, it's general anesthetic. So you just go
Okay.
to sleep for it.
Damn.
But then for most people, that's not necessarily the end of the line. Although if you have a laparoscopy and they discover endometriosis, then depending on its severity, they can remove it there and then. The problem with mine is that because of some of my symptoms, they did the laparoscopy and they said, we think you have it, but it's in your bowel. So, in order to get endometriosis removed from your bowel, it's a much more invasive procedure. And they said that although it can be beneficial, it's very rarely ever a kind of 100% success rate, and it can
Mm.
actually leave you with things like a coloscopy bag, and things like that. So it can end up actually having really, really detrimental long-term side effects. So when they told me this, they were like, we can do this bigger operation, we can see if we can remove it. However, it might not be worth it because it could grow back. You could be left with a coloscopy bag, and it might just, actually inhibit your quality of life. So the only other option for that was just to put me on long-term hormonal birth control, which isn't really a solution in my opinion.
Thanks for listening to the Understand Your Cycle podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to hear the rest of the episode next week.